So people are still joining our digital Berlin Center space. I will wait a little minute and then I will introduce you to the speakers and we can start. So this is the third in our series of events following our economic outlook that we presented last week where the OECD is joined by economic research centers across Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And we're debating different aspects of, well, the economic outlook, and in particular, of course, the recovery after the pandemic. So we've talked about the digital transformation, and today we have a very important other subject, which is the fiscal institutions that we will need in order to ensure that we can control both debt, but also ensure that we have a strong recovery, that we can manage the digital and the green transformation. And with us today is our OECD chief economist, Laurence Boone, who's going to present what we have to say about this subject. And we are also very happy to be joined by a number of heads of research centers. There's Christoph Badelt, who heads the Austrian Economic Institute and is also a part of the Austrian or the director of the Austrian Fiscal Council. Michael Hüther heads the German Economic Institute. Jan Eckbert-Sturm is the head of Konjunkturforschungsstelle at ETH Zurich, and we're also joined by Philippa Siegel-Glöckner, who heads Dezernat Zukunft. And we might be joined later by Clemens Fuest, who heads the IFO Institute. So without further ado, Laurence, I give you the floor.
Clemens is here. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Nicola. I just want to say that Clemens is actually here on the screen, and thanks for being there along with Christoph, Philippa, and Jan Eckbert. And thanks, Nicola, for the invitation. It would be a lot nicer to be in Berlin in person, obviously, but at least we have to do with that for the time being. And thanks for the generous introduction, Nicola. The OECD has even more to say about fiscal policy than what I'm going to say today, but it's certainly a very interesting debate, especially at the moment. So I'm going to share my screen. Here you are. And everything's good, Nicola? You can see? Okay. So this is just coming about a week after we issued the economic outlook, and Nicola did something in Berlin for this, but the work on we've been working more specifically on fiscal frameworks for quite some months now, and I'm very happy to be able to share that with you. So first, let me go to where we stand, just as a reminder, and I won't spend a lot of time here, but you can see from this chart that we've actually upgraded our projections, which are in orange, from what we were forecasting in December. Also, we're still below what was 2019 projections. And part of this upgrade is the vaccination, and a large part of it as well is the extraordinary fiscal and monetary support throughout the pandemic. And because we're still quite some way away from renewing with the type of path that we had before, obviously, we are quite cautious about the future, about shifting fiscal policy, and I'll come back to this. But I think what we really want to take away with this chart is, you know, how important the gap remains and what that means for European countries, which is here. So what you can see here, and this is one of the concerns we have with this recovery, is how uneven it is across countries. And in particular, if the US and Ireland have renewed with their growth path that with the living standard they had before the pandemic, which is not the growth path, most of European countries, and Germany is somewhere here, will take until the end of the year. And in some cases, like, for example, Austria or France, it will take likely another year before renewing with where we were prior to the pandemic. That obviously depends on the support that was provided, the composition of the economy in terms of sectors, and also how they were hit by the pandemic. But nevertheless, we have these differences. And what's really striking to us is that, whereas the US is returning to a situation where there was zero output gap, in Europe, we're returning to a situation where for some countries, the output gap was still open. And I think that's important to take in mind. Now, this imbalances also between the US and Europe concerns us because of what we see in the US with, a lot of pent-up demand being released, putting pressure on supply, the economy growing very fast, rates possibly going up now in the long-term rates. And that obviously will have some spillover onto Europe, just like the stimulus from the US has spillover. But this spillover on financial conditions may not be that welcome at this stage of the crisis. So this imbalance between the US and Europe and the unevenness across Europe is a concern to us. Now, one of the things we have said in previous outlook is we were not so much arguing, we were not arguing for more fiscal support in Europe. Because we have automatic stabilizers, because we have very different initial position. With its 3 plans, the US is really catching up also on some things that it was doing in less than healthcare coverage, social safety net, all this. We were more arguing, and we were also vaccinating less fast. But keeping that in mind for how to shape fiscal policy in the future is important. And the first recommendation we made in the economic outlook was that, in this transition period, the question was not so much whether we should start withdrawing fiscal support. Some of it will go naturally as people get back to work, but how you shift fiscal support, how you make it more targeted, and how you make sure that it goes to the right investment, which is obviously a big topic. So that's one thing. And the second recommendation we were making is that looking ahead, it's super important to actually think of what went wrong with public finances in Europe before COVID crisis. So what we're very concerned about is not so much the COVID debt itself, but how public finances were managed before. And the reason why we're concerned with this is partly on this chart. This chart is actually doing long-term projections of the type of tax increase we would see if there was no policy change, and assuming that countries start to consolidate in, return to a normal primary balance in 2023. So we leave 2022 with still some fiscal support, and also assuming some benign condition on the interest rate, so that R minus G, since you have all heard a lot about it, remains very supportive. And even with this benign assumption, in the absence of policy change in public finances on the public spending side, then you can see that to stabilize the debt at the level of 2023 with higher growth, then we would have a huge increase in fiscal pressure. And for some countries which started with already high tax to GDP ratio, it's obviously not something that can be considered like this. So what this chart, the message from this chart is really that we need to change the way we manage public finances, because that doesn't look very sustainable in the medium term. And the second thing I want to say is the object of the spending earlier could have been, huge investments in green infrastructure, in digital infrastructure, in health infrastructure, transport, and that would help to lift potential growth alongside health spending and reforms. But what this chart is showing is that has not been the case really, because what we have seen, and especially in the wake of the financial crisis, is that to try and contain the evolution of public finances, most European countries have cut on investment, and especially whether they had high or low debt to GDP ratio at the end of the period, as you can see from the right-hand side of this chart. So the message of these two charts is that structurally, there's debt slippage, and there will be more pressure because of aging on public finances. And at the same time, the debt slippage wasn't used to perhaps productive usage. So you will tell me, okay, but we had fiscal rules, right? So everybody should have behaved roughly the same way, and those public finances should have been managed in roughly the same way. But one thing that's interesting is it's true, fiscal rules have become very widespread over the last decades, but at the same time, there does not seem to be a strong correlation between the evolution of public finances and fiscal rules. In fact, when we look at a granular level, what is really striking is that the countries which adopt fiscal rule and abide by the fiscal rules, they are usually the countries which have put their public finances in order before. So the fiscal rule is something that will consolidate the move to better public finances, but it's rarely something that actually triggers better public finances. But you could argue that it actually prevents deterioration of public finances management. But what I'm trying to say here is it doesn't necessarily reflect ownership by the public, by the policymakers, by the parliament of how one should manage their public finances. Which brings me here. One of the, and I think that's where I want to spend a little more time on, since we have started this work. One of the very striking things when we compare countries across the OECD, not only the European Union, is that public finances reflect more the evolution of how policymakers and parliamentaries and the population consider public finances, how much they're aware of it, how it is used in the public debate. If you think about it, there are three main reasons why we may have that slippage when they're not economic reasons. The first one is electoral cycles. As you know, before election, in some jurisdiction, there will be an increase in public spending if the people want to have a nudge for winning again, or they will spend the money that was in the coffer to make sure that the opposition party coming along will not have so much money. And there is some empirical evidence for this, so it's not overwhelming. It really depends on countries and regions. The second thing is what we call the common pool issue, which is a reflection of the fragmented political landscape of voters or parties. It's basically a group of interests representing, for example, the building industry, or then the automobile industry, or then the hotel and restaurant industry. They come and they ask for tax credit or support in terms of investment. And, for them, it's a lot, but for the entire community, it is not so much. So the governments grant the tax credit or the subsidies, and by itself, it's not that many. But if you have many groups coming along, then at the end of the day, the bill starts being expensive, and also it accumulates over time. And the third point is what we call fiscal illusion. And I think that's where the ownership by people of what it is to have good public finance management is important. If voters do not really know the constraint on public finances, if they don't realize the consequences for growth or for intergenerational issues, then in fact they might not include this in the way they vote. I think let me give you one example, which I find very striking. In one study by Stephanie Stancheva from Harvard, she tested in France what people knew about taxation and fiscal policy. And she asked what is the marginal income tax rate for households, and also how many people are paying income taxes. And the responses are very surprising. The marginal income tax rate is 49%. Most people think it's about 30%. And only half of households pay the income tax. And most of those people think that, much less than that pay the income tax. So the knowledge about this is very poor. And if you imagine that if the immediate knowledge is very poor, then the impact of public finances changes on future generations or on balances is even poorer. So for all these reasons, I think our common feature of countries that have seen their public finances gradually slipped over time. Okay, now a positive thing, because this is not all doom and gloom and we can do something about this. And with this slide, we wanted to remind people that, you can actually motivate or trigger some changes in the way people consider public finances. But I also wanted to show that, even if you need some continuous fiscal support today, by anchoring expectation for the future, you can start actually changing the mindset. And a credible anchor does change the mindset. What you can see here, it was in the run-up to the euro, how the prospect of getting into the euro had led countries to actually manage their public finances much better, right? On the left-hand side, you have the underlying government primary balance, so excluding interest rate movement, and you can see that across the euro area, it's drastically improved in the run-up to the euro. So in one word, if we did it once, we must be able to do it another time. Okay, so where does that leave us? I think what really I wanted to say here was to use some international experience to highlight how the institutional setup matter. And by the reason why I'm focusing on institutional setup, it's because they embed and they reflect the culture of the country, but also how much information people get. And I think one of the key things in triggering better public finances management is that we have the information and analysis at all levels that matters to actually, choose rightly the priority spending, choose rightly how the tax system is set up, and that will deeply change the way that we're managing public finances. And if I just highlight two countries which have a superb institution here, one is the Netherlands, the other one is New Zealand. In each country, the forecasts for the budget are made by an independent body. It's not just checking, it's the actual process of doing the projections. In each country, each time there's a law or policy going on, which may have an impact on GDP growth or distribution issues, there's an assessment and it's made public and it's debated in the parliament. In the Netherlands, even each party's manifestos is assessed by the Central Planning Bureau with its impact on growth in the short, medium and long term, and what it means also for distribution. And it's the same in New Zealand, and twice a year they have to justify what they have done with the money. And I think that's super important. And the reason why I think it's super important is because this has implication for Europe. And what I'm trying to say here is we're going to have very different situation. We know fiscal rules as they existed before probably prevented slippage, but they did not foster good public finance management. One of the key issues is that people there's not enough ownership by everybody and in their institution of this public finance management. This needs to change because of the future pressure from aging, but also climate commitment. And for that, we need to have a much stronger democratic debate with much more robust information. And one of the things that I think would make a difference is this independent fiscal institution, because they will lead people to agree with the choices on spending and on taxes. And fiscal sustainability has a lot to do with that. So I hope I wasn't too long, Nicola, and I will stop here.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Laurence. Perhaps just to feed into the debate that we're going to have, which is going to be both about Europe, but also the individual countries that are around the table, so to speak. With your independent fiscal institution, do you think it should be at the European level, at the country level, or both?
Okay, so let me start from here. First, when we look at the public debt situation, public finance situation of European countries, usually it's much more widely different than, you know, when we were in this time. It goes from 40% to 160. So having the same fiscal rule, say in 2023, seems, I mean, I don't think anybody thinks it's reasonable. The second thing is what I was really trying to say. It's the practice has been very different across countries, and we need to actually have an awareness across countries of how things are done. But for some of them, it's an issue of both. For others, it's an issue of the parliament. But if you take into account the diversity of the countries and you look at the fiscal number, I think what that means is these numbers, the precise numbers, they cannot be the same for all European countries. They have to be decided at the national level, and they have to be endorsed at the national level. So the precision of rules has to be at the national level. It's also because the level of tax to GDP ratio or public spending to GDP ratio it's a very democratic choice, and the governments vote on it. So we have to make them own that commitment, and the same with the level of debt, which is what happens in New Zealand, for example. But the second point is obviously each European country is living in this monetary union, so we have to have some kind of endorsement at the EU level. And at the EU level, we do have a European Fiscal Board, and we can have principles for good fiscal management, and what every country is doing at the national level could be assessed and endorsed assessed by the European Fiscal Board and endorsed by the European Council, because they're the executive body, and that's where they are. So you would have more ownership at the national level, and the safeguard endorsed by the European political level, which is the Council. So you reverse the hierarchy of what is done today.
Perfect. Thank you very much for Laurence. And now I'm just going to ask you to take that. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Thank you very much. And then to start the discussion, so perhaps Michael Hüther, of course, we met recently and talked about fiscal rules and then the need for investment in Germany and what can we do about this. So this, so we debate a little bit the concrete fiscal rules in Germany, but perhaps a lot less what Laurence suggested here, that we really need more transparency, engagement with citizens, with parliaments, and also making it clear that the investment, the drive for fairness is there, so that people buy into the rules. How do you view that? Perhaps also with respect to the ideas you have come up with for investment. Do things need to evolve in Germany and perhaps also at the European level?
I think an interesting point, because in other states like the US or the states mentioned here, they have something like a congressional or parliamentary budget office that makes the implications transparent of a fiscal policy decision made in 1 year for the long term. If we look on the local level in Germany, it's interesting to see that since we used the double entry bookkeeping, it's more simple to explain that on the one hand, you have a stock, the capital stock owned by the city or by the municipality, and we have to care about the capital stock in the time. This is very simple to explain to the people. And if you use this double entry bookkeeping, it's also quite clear that you should be aware about the depreciation and you have to invest for that. And the credit financing of this public investment is nothing else that take care on the capital stock. So I think using this double entry bookkeeping would help us to bring this to the state level and the federal level. It's a long way to go, because not so simple. What is the capital stock of the federal level, for example, at the starting point? But it will tackle the problem which is behind what Laurence Boone explained to us, that over time we had a high cyclical pattern of public investment. That's the most important problem, because this cyclical deviations over time in public investment should be more focusing on growth and should be stable over time, have the impact that, for example, in the public administration, we have not the people we need to manage the public investment. Yeah, because there's an under expenditure, not enough expenditure for these administrative conditions we have to fulfill. So get more stable public investment over time to make it transparent, and maybe a different idea of bookkeeping could be help us to make it transparent to the people and to bring the people in understanding what's going on.
So basically, double good bookkeeping to see whether we are underinvesting would be your suggestion.
Only one example on that. Just this week, I had a discussion with the administration here in Cologne. And the person who is in charge of the finance, of the public finance and the budget here in Cologne said it's very simple to make clear that we use credit financing for investment because we do have this double entry bookkeeping. This is not the problem, but we have to be stable over time, and we need the people then to handle all this investment.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Jan Eckbert, so sometimes there are debates also, well, do the rules need to evolve? For example, in order to be able to invest enough after this crisis. When we had a discussion recently, you said, well, basically, in Switzerland, everything is perfect. We're back to where we were almost in terms of output and or soon, and there's no underinvestment, etc. So in terms of the transparency of fiscal policy, do you think that you have what you need so that people can understand whether enough is being invested, whether the effect of fiscal policy is fair enough? Or in light of this presentation, do you think things could evolve also a little bit in Switzerland?
Thanks. Switzerland is indeed a bit different than some of these other countries, and that's partly from a historical reasons because of the federalism and in particular the direct democracy. So in Switzerland, there is a relatively high awareness of the public finance situation and about this attitude that at the end of the day, the government can only spend what it actually earns in revenue, and it shouldn't continuously overspend, so to speak. There have been mechanisms in place already for a couple of years now in which there is sufficient amount of funding being reserved for investment activities, for in particular infrastructure activities. So we in Switzerland already have quite some experience on that front. But I do see some of the elements which were discussed before, like for instance, having an independent body who actually watches what's happening with the fiscal finance situation is not something in Switzerland which is being discussed. And I can't see that that's going to happen anytime soon. And perhaps that's because of the direct democracy situation in which people are already from very young onwards being trained to think about what the public does with it, what the government does with its money, and makes decisions for the government with them in referenda. So the situation in Switzerland in that sense is quite different from almost all other European countries.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Jan Eckbert. Christoph Badelt, you're not only the head of WIFO, but you're also in the Fiscal Advisory Council of Austria. Is what Laurence had just outlined, is that something that you are doing or plan to do? So not only watching over the macroeconomic situation, does fiscal policy abide with the rules, but also looking at its longer term sustainability and then the effects on growth, on investment, on equity. Are you going that far in the advisory council?
Well, I have been appointed president to the Fiscal Advisory Council about a month ago, so it's really hard for me to say what effect this will have. But of course, I have observed the activities of the Fiscal Advisory Council. And my impression is that when the Fiscal Advisory Council raises his voice, then this is reflected in the media. But I don't think that it really can overrule let me say, populistic decisions made by the government. And if you look at slide, I think it was slide 5, which have been presented, you see that Austria is a country with comparatively low public investments out of GDP. And I think there's a good political reason for this. I think economists have always stated that we are spending much money into social expenditures and too little money into direct investments. Although one can also see social expenditures in a certain extent, or some of them, as investments, although this is not counted as an investment by the system of national accounts. If you just think on active labor market policy, just to give an example. But so I have my doubts. That on a more technical level, we can really change the situation. I do, of course, however, believe that fiscal framework, fiscal rules by the EU can have an influence and should have an influence in case that there are sanctions if they are not fulfilled. And this brings, because this is something the government is trying to prevent. And therefore, I think we really should talk about what characteristics should new fiscal rules have in Europe. And one thing I would say is, apart from the fact that they should be realistic and they should be less complicated, and that they should be achievable, I think they can and they should give incentives for necessary investments. And I think this brings us into the debate of a golden rule. I'm quite resistant, I'm cautious concerning a general golden rule, but I think one could discuss about temporary rules which are not focused on investments in general, but for example, on green investments, on infrastructure investment, on digitalization investments, basically things which are now in the European plan on the expenditure sides anyway. So, and also I think the new fiscal regime should make it possible that paths for individual countries, or countries of certain categories, are specified in a different way, because it doesn't make sense, as it is theoretically the case now, to define any, I don't know, deficit rule or expenditure rule or debt out of GDP rule, and the same is true for Greece and for Germany. That I think is not realistic. So I think, against the background of the political system in Austria, I think that fiscal rules and more and improved fiscal rules would be worthwhile. I would not rely just on the judgment of economists.
Laurence, before I go to Clemens and Clemens, Fuest and Philippa, I wanted perhaps give you a chance to take this up, but also ask you perhaps a concrete question about these fiscal advisory groups, or the transparency, the engagement you described in New Zealand and the Netherlands. Because of course, what we're debating, right, sufficient investment, but in particular rules, equity, all of this is, so fiscal policy for most people is quite technical, right? So how do these countries achieve this, that they're being transparent enough to really promote a public debate that takes people along, gets the buy-in that you described and that you think is really important to promote sustainable fiscal policy?
Thank you, Nicola, and thanks. It was really interesting to listen to Christoph, Jan Seilberg, and Michael. I think, you know, there's one thing. First, what I hear is that in each country or in each setup, the way that public finances are managed matter and reflect the country's preferences. In Switzerland, it's this a very direct democracy. In Austria, like actually in many other smaller European states, there's this call for an external rule to help strengthen the public finances. So all the people so far, and I'm sure it will be the same with Clemens and with Philippa, do react with respect to what they see in their own country and how they perceive the situation to be in their own country, which does call to have the specificities. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that we can rely on economists' judgment only. It's bringing information, but the specificity of the framework, the specificity of the rule, how it functions, what type of target you want, what type of commitment mechanism you want, has to be decided at the national level. Also because fiscal policy is the most democratic policy. It's, when you think about it, what the parliament votes on most of the time is the budget. Their power is there. So that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to comment on is investment. I totally agree that some social expenditure are investment. Education is an investment, but national accounting doesn't record that as investment. The first decade of the euro had seen an amazing accounting creativity in terms of public finances. And for me, if we go back to this type of rules, we're going to see all sorts of creativity to call investment what's not necessarily investment. So again, unless it's something that's very specific to one country, because there's a mutual understanding in that country, that's the way to pursue, it's good. But I don't think there is one fiscal rule that's better than another. It's just that it has to be endorsed and accepted and owned by the people and the democracy there. And that brings me to your question, Nicolas. So let me give you an example. Independent forecast, I think, is very important. In France, which has a restricted fiscal board, since the fiscal board, because the task of the fiscal board is mostly to focus on the forecast. Since it exists, suddenly the forecasts are much less optimistic than they were before. And they're much closer to the consensus. And you know, the elasticity of employment or employment growth forecasts are also much more realistic. So you can see here very concretely how this can have an influence. It has to be very simple things. What do you do with €1? What does it, why do you want, for example, in countries where there is, I'm going to give an Italian example because I see that my colleague Mauro Pisu is here. For the Italian survey, the last Italian survey and analysis he did a real dive into the tax benefit system, what the citizen income that was proposed by the Italian authorities at the time meant, and how you could actually change some of the parameters or the proposal to make it more efficient. But this information, I think, is precious. It can be published by an OECD survey, but it can be discussed in Parliament, it can be discussed in the paper, and there needs to be a lot more communication. And I do think that this type of information, most people miss it to actually make enlightened choices. And if you allow me just 1 minute, I want to rebound as well on what was said by Michael earlier on, the lack of people to manage public investment. That's also an issue because effectively you talk about investment, and then if we compare, for example, our two countries, and even our two capital cities, Berlin and Germany, you can see how long it takes to make an investment, which is most often the case because of regulation. I'm thinking about the big Paris, and I see Clemens smiling, and we all have Berlin Airport in mind, right? But what I'm trying to say here, it's a common issue to actually.
It's not fair.
I put it Paris first. We have the same issue, but it just reflects that this culture of public investment, in a way, we have lost, and also it's difficult to assess quality investment. But we have decarbonization ahead of us, and I think it's super important to actually think a lot harder than we did before about this. Sorry, I was long. Thank you.
Oh, perfect, Laurence. Clemens Fuest, probably you were happy to hear there was no strong endorsement of a golden rule, at least at the European level. But I would be interested to hear what you think about this idea that well, there should be a governing framework at the European level, but that it's important to have that each country in a way can have its way in terms of setting commitments, how to get there, establishing institutions. Do you think that could be something that would help to have more buy-in for fiscal sustainability and make things more transparent? Also the type of analysis that Laurence just mentioned about, it was tax credits, I think, in Italy, right? To have more of this kind of analysis so that people and parliaments can have an informed debate about what fiscal policy actually means.
First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a great debate. Now, yes, I do agree in particular to 2 points made by Laurence. I think they are very important. The first is the role of ownership. If we have learned something, it is very difficult to convince countries from Brussels that they should change their fiscal policies. This hasn't really worked. People don't accept that. They perceive this as, some kind of bureaucratic dictatorship. We know that's not quite fair, but that's what's going on. So ownership, I'm convinced, is very important, and that has implications for the fiscal framework, indeed. The other thing is independent institutions, I think, can really make a contribution. They can take different forms. It's country specific, and I think the type of independent institution, for instance, we have in Germany is insufficient. I was a member of the German Fiscal Council for some time, and as Christoph Badelt just said, if you cannot make your own calculations, or if it's not the institution making the calculations, it's not taken too seriously. You can make, a couple of public statements, but that doesn't work very well. In principle, I'm sympathetic to another final point I would like to underline from Laurence's presentation is that let me start with Michael's point about double entry bookkeeping. Now, I think that is an idea where most economists are intuitively sympathetic. Unfortunately, the evidence isn't very favorable. So one example, we have a recent study on the introduction of double entry bookkeeping in Germany, and it didn't increase investment. It didn't improve the efficiency of public services. It didn't change the level of government debt, but it did increase administrative costs. That was all. So that's a disappointing result. This kind of accounting does make a lot of sense economically, but does it work in practice? I think we need a lot more evidence on that. Now, why do we need a European fiscal framework? I mean, on the basis of all of this, you could say, okay, let's have proper national fiscal institutions. There is a national interest in stable public finances. Why have something at the European level? And indeed, we need it in particular because we have the common currency. So in the common currency, the trouble is that if one country we know goes deeply into debt, it can make other countries pay for its debt. That's the experience of the Euro crisis. That's the experience of the COVID crisis, where we have had this European solidarity and redistribution. If you have your own, I mean, in the COVID crisis, it was more. But if you have your own currency, you devalue, and that's it, and you bear the cost of of debt crisis on your own. And we know that in the Euro crisis, in the Eurozone, we need to help each other because the spillovers are very strong on the common currency and so on. So there are, if you like, negative externalities of national debt on other countries which are stronger than in systems with independent national currencies. And that's why we need some common framework. But I think it's helpful to start at the national level. Maybe in the reform before us, we should move our attention more towards ownership of fiscal rules, and that means we need to put a stronger emphasis on national processes generating fiscal rules and objectives, and then we need a European agreement about that. When we started the currency union, it was a bit the other way around. So, Brussels or maybe Germany said, we need these rules, and everybody else said, okay, we will accept that, and we'll join in. So I think it does make sense to do it the other way around.
Do you think currently the ownership for the German fiscal rules is strong? Is it good? Would you change anything?
Well, that's something else Laurence already said. So fiscal frameworks are very much an expression of political views about debt, not a cause of fiscal policy. So I think they don't really constrain fiscal policy very much. They reflect what people think. This was clearly the case when the debt brake was introduced. The conservative parties, the Social Democrats at the time were convinced, at least a majority, that we need to do something about the increase in debt. And then the result was the introduction of this rule. There is a large literature on this, and the evidence is mixed. Yes, there are some papers saying, okay, the impact is also the other way around, but I think it reflects changes in views. And currently, there is a shift in views among political parties, because interest rates are so low. People think, we should go more into debt. And that's why there is less endorsement, I think, and less ownership of the debt brake, which is surprising in my view, because maybe not the debt brake, but the fiscal policy before the crisis has helped us a lot in this crisis. I think that's what a lot of people do perceive. The budget surpluses that were very much criticized, the black zero, was very helpful in preserving fiscal space in this crisis for Germany.
Thank you, Clemens Fuest. And Philippa, I have a question from my old colleague, Felix Hübner, that I'm going to ask you. So he's asking, does the debt brake in Germany now actually limit public investment, or needs to be reformed, or does it leave enough space through loopholes? You in some ways, you are looking at loopholes, or loopholes, but using space, let's say, more creatively than has been done before. But what do you think, how would you react to Felix's question, but also in the light of what we've discussed before about advisory councils, transparency, etc.?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really interesting discussion. So on investment, I'm not sure about the extent to which it's a quantity constraint, but then I'm also not sure it really makes sense to talk in pure quantities, because especially with investment, the important thing is to invest in the right thing, that you actually get productivity out of it. And there, I think it really puts a constraint on it, because at the moment, if you don't try and find loopholes, investment isn't exempted. Which may also be problematic, because we talked about accounting definitions and whether it's possible to find one that captures investment properly. So currently it's not exempted, which means it basically depends on how much fiscal space you have, which is very, very unpredictable, because it depends on the calculation of your cyclical budget component under the debt brake. So how much debt we're allowed to run under the debt brake. And investment is obviously always kind of the marginal add-on. So that means investment fluctuates a lot, and a lot of investment programs are quite short-term, especially when central government supports the local level, which is where we have the biggest investment gaps. These programs often come with very short notice, and then they kind of follow a political agenda for the better or the worse. Some agendas make sense, right? We need to digitize and we need to put money in education. But if you do that with very short notice, and then you tell municipalities within 2 years they need to, digitize their schools and do whatever, but they don't have the staff and they haven't planned it properly, the money often doesn't get spent, or when it gets spent, maybe not very well. I think Michael already mentioned the staffing issue. I actually spoke to some people working in that field, and they said, well, it's also very difficult to get good people on temporary contracts, because you have these investment programs and then you scale up your staff, but only for 2, 3, 4 years that the program runs. You don't get great people to do this at local level. And by the time you've trained them and they know how procurement works, the program is over. So I think this is a big problem, that it fluctuates. And obviously that it also means, I guess you try and sometimes you think kind of backwards, what kind of investment can we do so that it works with the fiscal rules, either because you kind of use a shadow budget, or because you use a loophole through a public corporation, which means you can only do certain types of investment. So basically, I think the main problem is that by having the wrong focus on what you can do in what moment fiscally, rather than thinking about, you know, what actually is productive and makes sense, you don't really allocate your investment and do it in the way you should do it to be most effective.
And Egbert, so I think we've heard from Christoph Badelt, but also the German side. I think there's a little bit the sense that there is an investment backlog in those two countries, Germany and Austria. You will correct me if I haven't reflected that correctly. But I think it's a lot less so, at least your view in Switzerland. And Laurence made this important point that sometimes with the airport in Berlin or Grand Paris, it's also the rules, but perhaps the administrative capacity at the local level that can keep back investment, even if the money is somehow there. So what's the secret of Switzerland? Are the rules simpler? Is it the direct democracy? Or are there some problems that we just simply haven't spotted?
Yeah, well, Switzerland is a country that has a long reputation of doing large investment projects. So at least from the country's own perspective, and the institutional setup has been there for a long time and seems to be working pretty well. What I would like to confirm a little bit is some of the points which Clemens made in particular, namely that indeed ownership is very important also in the Swiss case. Yes. In the Swiss case, we had this referendum introducing the Swiss debt brake, and it was basically 80% of the population voted in favor of that. And that is still one of the major reasons why politics can't really touch that. That's because they know that there is this really strong ownership in their own population. And the Corona crisis has shown it once again. Indeed, we've had 15 years before Corona in which Switzerland was able to reduce the public debt situation. We started with a level of 45% of GDP in 2004 to 5. That went down to 30%. Now, currently, we see some increase, but obviously the increase is in relative terms quite marginal because we had these good years. And this is now also again being seen by the general public. We need to have a system which in good periods in general saves money to be able in these crisis periods, which do come sudden and do come in a very strong fashion, be able to react. As this is not answering your question, because for that, I don't really have a very good answer, except that there is long-term experience in managing these large infrastructure projects in the Swiss particular situation. And even now in the crisis, that hasn't stopped whatsoever. That part of construction industry went on as usual, so to speak, and there is sufficient funds to keep that going for the upcoming years.
Perfect, thank you. Michael Hüther, you also have come up with ideas how more investment, so the necessary investment for strong recovery could be secured within or outside the fiscal rules. But perhaps you could also comment a little bit on this point that Laurence made about the rules and the regulatory complexity and administrative capacity at the local level, because you've also argued forcefully that these are two issues, at least in.
Yeah. Let me start with the last point, and has also to do with what Clemens mentioned. Yes, the double entry bookkeeping is not the solution for all problems we have. At the same time, we had a lot of structural problems in municipalities' finances. So one of the reasons for understaffing and the reasons for too low investment on the local level has to do with the bad situation in local public finances. So all this together has to be solved. That's the first. The second, for the medium term, to get a more stable investment activity is something in line what Christoph Badelt said, that we need transparency about that. I think you can convince the German politics and German public if you will explain what are the big challenges we have ahead. We are facing decarbonization. We have to do a lot of digital infrastructure. We have an aging economy. And for that, we have to invest. And you can explain very simple what are the investment needs and put it in one program, put it aside and do it over a long time. And you can organize this in line with the German debt brake if you're using a private company as an owner for this task. It could be transparent. You can use For example, the German Stability Council, which can say this is really okay, that's an investment for the medium term. Then if there's approval from the Stability Council, then there's some backing for this idea. So I think we have to work on this, because I think very interesting slide from Laurence Boone was the upward pressure on public finance. You mentioned in this slide healthcare, pension scheme, all this is age of society. We have to pay more for international policy for international security, our defense budget. So the competition to use one tax euro will increase. And for that, you have to make clear in which way you will organize the public investment activity. And that's the idea of a specific fund using maybe a vehicle as a public-owned company. Yeah, then you can do this with the debt break, and it will be transparent and accountable.
Okay, thank you very much. Christoph Badelt, so you're the new president of the Austrian Fiscal Council. Oh, 2 hands up. We have very little time, so we have to be short. Well, I let you say what you wanted to say, but perhaps just also whether you get some inspiration for how to set up your advisory council under your presidency.
No. I'm sure that we will emphasize the necessity to shift public expenditures into the direction of investment. There is no doubt about it. But I'm also realistic in the sense that the competition, which Michael has just mentioned, the competition between conflicting expenditure goals, very often, and not only in years immediately before elections, is solved through the relative strength of groups of the electorate. The best example is the number of retired people. We have had, even in the Corona years, although from an economic standpoint, pensioners have not been affected at all by Corona in an economic sense. We decided on relatively high increases in old age retirement pensions. This is just an example. And of course, it is quite clear that from a long-term thinking, investments in other issues will be important. And I'm not talking about infrastructure alone, although the whole issue of the green economy will probably help, because when you invest into the improvement of buildings, into the public transport system, that may also be popular. But I think we should not underestimate the role of populism in these decisions.
Okay, I have 4 hands up and very little time, but I did want to ask Laurence one thing before we respond to the raised hands. Laurence, because you also mentioned this interaction between the national level and the European level, and I very much can understand your point that we need the kind of analysis that Mauro does in the economic survey for Italians to understand how their tax credits work. But do we need something like that also at the European level, as the economic policy in one country influences other countries? So to get a buy-in, well, both at the country level, but somehow also beyond that.
Thank you. So I think when it comes to the hierarchy of what happens at the national and the European level, yes, there is a lot of work to do to explain the spillover, as Clemens was mentioning earlier, not only on the growth side, but also from single market, and also from fiscal policy. But it has to be balanced, right? There has long been this debate between some sort of asymmetric assessment at the European level when we look at the macroeconomic stance or when we look at macroeconomic issues. So I mean, and you know, we address widening negative current account deficit, negative or current account deficit. We don't address what was excessive positive current accounts. We do the same with fiscal policy, and we still don't talk about the European fiscal stance. So that's something here. I do think that we need to really tackle this issue of the fiscal framework in Europe. For one thing, which, if only for one thing that Clemens made me thought about, it was very striking to see in this crisis how countries which perceived to have a higher fiscal space came in the crisis with much more comfort to address the crisis and provide the safety net. So even policymakers in some countries didn't feel so comfortable, and as a result, they naturally constrained themselves with the type of safety net that they should have provided. So it's really an issue that's super important, because we're getting out of the crisis. It's not sure that we're fully out of it. And if you look at the regularity, the frequency of crisis in Europe, we need to do something. But thanks, I'm very curious to hear what Jacek, Philippa, and Clemens want to add.
That's right. Very good. But we have I'll take your questions. You just have to be brief, because there are two constraints. One is, I'm sure Laurence has another constraint, but Michael has his, if I may, his 33rd wedding anniversary. And I have to pick up the kids, so we have to be very brief. I start with, I think I had Philippa first. I go on the, and then I'll go to the others. Philippa.
I'll try and be very brief. Family reasons are important ones. Just briefly on fiscal institutions. I think it's important to first also identify what exactly the challenge today is. And Laurence, you very much talked about slippages at the aggregate level, especially after having worked in the German finance ministry and in the Liberian finance ministry, which are like the two opposite ends of the world. Actually, there are some similarities everywhere. And I'm not sure slippages really are defined so much only at the aggregate level. Even in Germany, where, maybe there we constrain ourselves quite tightly or not, but we obey a rule. You can still waste a lot of money. So, that doesn't necessarily mean you have good productive spending when you go at the micro level. And I think this is really what it's about, especially because the macro, having more debt doesn't bite you that much today because interest rates are low. What really bites you is if you don't have a productive economy, if you don't spend it on education, childcare, whatever helps you to especially tackle the demographic challenge. So I think when we think about institutions, we really need to think about how can they help us do that? And then the New Zealand example, I think, is very interesting, but it also shows you the limit of the debate or what it can't do. Because if you look at actually their parliamentary discussions and you read the documents, they're exactly the same as here. It's not really about identifying like more productive stuff. It's like, this is what we want and this is what we want. And every side always wants like typical kind of things for a political party. So I mean, I really hope this kind of enlightened version of fiscal policy is possible, but I still wonder how we can really make it work.
Jan Eckbert, you had a comment?
Yeah, just a quick one in that sense, because it was raised also about local public finances. And again, Switzerland, I think, shows something very important here. Namely, again, it's the kind of ownership which is important also at the municipal and cantonal level. And in that context, indeed, the no bailout clause, which is very, very clear in the Swiss society. A municipality will not be bailed out by the canton. The canton will not be bailed out by the federal government. So one has to make sure that together with the citizens of the respective community, so to speak, that there is in general a balanced budget. As there is no one else, so to speak, to get you out of the mess if you produce your mess yourself. And so I think that's pretty important to understand the Swiss system. It's really this ownership with all dimensions of the ownership, not only that the society understands it, that the voters understand what you're talking about, but also that the cantonal authorities and the municipality authorities are aware that they have to deal with any problem which might emerge.
Laurence, the OECD has to dig deeply into the ownership in Switzerland and see how it can be translated to transferred to other countries. Clemens, Fuest, you had another point.
I'm in full agreement with Jan Eckbert's point about no bailouts. We have forgotten this in Europe, but we could be more relaxed about who has which level of debt if we didn't have to pay for other people's debt. And that's a problem. But what I wanted to say is, I think when we think about fiscal rules, one step is to say, okay, we should think more about the growth impact of public finances and take into account public investment. I think if we do that, we only pick one aspect really. And if we want to go down this route, we need to go a lot further, because if you think about the impact of public finances on growth, public investment is something very small. Public investment is something like 2% of GDP. Private investment is 16% of GDP. So public investment will never have the growth impact of private investment. And if a country, for instance, decide to shift a euro from public investment to, let's say, accelerated depreciation, the growth impact can be much larger, but a golden rule fiscal institution will not allow it. This doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. So if we think about changing, making fiscal institutions more ambitious and have them take into account the growth impact, I think we need to do something a lot more complex. And for instance, look at the tax structure. I mean, we have ideas in Germany to increase public investment and finance that through introducing a net wealth tax, which would bring down private investment probably by much more. This is contradictory in terms of growth, but a golden rule framework would allow it. So maybe we need to, if we want to go down this route, we need to be more ambitious and have a framework that tries to assess the overall growth friendliness. If we think about labor supply and many other aspects that impact growth, I think public investment is important, but it gets too much attention and we neglect the rest.
Thank you very much. So we are past our time, but Laurence, I think I want to give you, perhaps because we don't have you very often here in the German-speaking area, a last word, and just you present these type of ideas in many different contexts. So is there anything you take away from this specific perspectives you've heard from these German-speaking countries that inspires further development of these ideas?
Thanks. First, you don't have me in the German context because COVID is preventing me from crossing the border. Otherwise, I would very keen seeing old friends in Berlin. Second thing is, I think, in our way, all of us agree in a sense about the ownership, the culture, about also the role of investment. And it's true, there's something that we didn't talk about, which is public investment is an enabler of private investment. I don't think it can be a substitute to private investment, and that's super important to keep in mind. But in terms of ownership, of having more specificity at the national level, have been having a European hat or framework looking at what's happening at the national level, I think we all agree about this. The one thing perhaps that I would add before we leave ourselves a bit uncomfortable when we talk about the fact that there's no bailout rule in Switzerland or the US, but the federal spending is much bigger than what it is in Europe. So it's okay to let the municipalities go because you have a federal buffer. But that's all. I think I very much enjoyed the discussion, and I'm looking forward to pursuing it in a few months' time in Berlin, and it will be
personally. And we have to get Christoph and Jan Eckbert to Berlin too. So we really need to vaccinate Europe. So thank you very much, Laurence, for being here. Thank you, Jan Eckbert. Christoph, Badelt, Clemens, Fuest. Michael Hüther already left. Philippa, it was great to have you. And also there was a lot of action in the chat. I really enjoyed it. And now I have to run, but thank you very much. The only problem was we had too many interesting issues and too many good speakers for the little time we had. But I hope we can continue the discussion. Bye.
Say hi to your kids.
I will.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, thanks.
Bye-bye.